rather than investment in the productive sector. So, what's happened in the last 9 months? The people who employ most New Zealanders, apart from the public sector, small to medium enterprises and large corporates, have seen their lending cut $3 billion by the banks. And you can see here what also the banks have done. They have reduced their interest rates for businesses and farmers by only 230 basis points. So they passed on a lot of the official cash rate cut to housing and not so much to businesses. My contention is that banks are effectively subsidising.
Just a clarification for those watching, what was the total OCR drop during the period under consideration? It was 585?
Yeah, went from 8.25 to 2.5.
So of that 585, homes got 450, farms got 230, and the difference is what was retained.
Yes.
The question is whether that was justifiable.
Yes, yes. My contention is that the banks are subsidising cheap home lending by charging high rates for business and credit cards. Although I have less of a problem with the credit card stuff.
We've lost all the current account debtors.
Yes. So, this is the connection. Bank profits have doubled over the last 10 years because we've doubled our lending. We've also pretty much doubled our foreign debt. The last 10 years saw New Zealanders suck in about $100 billion in foreign debt. That was passed through the bank's accounts, they made profits from it, we pumped it into the property market and into dairy farms. We now have a foreign debt as a percentage of GDP of 140%, up from bubbling around 100% in the year 2000. That is a massive increase in the indebtedness of New Zealand Inc. in the space of a decade. It is unsustainable.
At the same time, the government debt has been reduced.
Yes. So the red line you can see is the government debt. When it says banks and corporates, you can cut out the and corporates. They've actually deleveraged. They've taken debt off their balance sheets in the last decade. That is all banks on our behalf.
Which is why it's the government budget deficit. It's not the whole story.
Yes. Yes. So this for me is the most interesting chart in the New Zealand economy right now. This for me tells us what's wrong with our economy.
Yeah, it's a very evocative chart.
Mm-hmm. It says that our tradable sector, so exporters and people who compete with importers, have essentially since 2003-04 gone backwards. They've not kept up with the rest of the economy, they've gone backwards. Because New Zealanders haven't invested and banks haven't lent to them, and to the same extent they have lent to the non-tradable sector, which basically means property. Why is that? I think we have some fundamental structural problems in the economy to do with how we incentivise investment, particularly in residential property. It is skewing the entire monetary system, it is pumping up our foreign debt, and it risks creating a loss of sovereignty for us in the next 5 to 10 years unless we stop it. Who in this room has an LAQC or a family trust? Can they please put up their hands? The amount of losses claimed by LAQCs, at least family trusts we can't get the data for, has risen, has basically doubled since 2003. New Zealanders have gone on a massive property investment binge to avoid paying tax. The banks help them, policymakers have done nothing to stop it.
We try.
Now, I want to try and map out what this loss of sovereignty might mean. Who knows this guy? This is Glenn Stevens. Glenn Stevens, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia. If we don't change this, he will be our Reserve Bank Governor. John Laker is the Chairman of the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority. If we don't change this, he will be regulating our banks. You could argue he informally already is. And that will be our currency. Why do I say this? In the last 9 months, Australia underwrote the New Zealand economy. In the last 9 months, the Australian banks pumped, by my estimates, more than $10 billion in fresh equity capital across the Tasman to pump up New Zealand bank balance sheets. In the last 9 months, Australian banks raised $20 billion Australian from Australian savers, from those big pension funds, from that pool of $1 trillion of savings. There is no way New Zealand savers, through our stock market or any other financial institutions, could have pumped at least $8 billion, probably $10 billion in fresh equity into New Zealand banks that would have required bank bailouts. In the last 9 months, New Zealanders don't understand this. The Australians understand it, I think, if you push them. APRA thinks about it a lot. In the last 9 months, New Zealand, the Australian government, through the deposit guarantee schemes, both retail and wholesale, and the Australian banks, underwrote the New Zealand economy. Now that's fine as long as our credit rating is AA+. Remember, the bank's credit rating is AA. If New Zealand's credit rating was to drop below AA+, that's 2 notches below where it is now, that would be a massive problem for the Australian banking system. More than a third to 35% of Australian banking assets are stuck in New Zealand. That becomes a political and a monetary policy and a regulatory policy issue for the Australian government and for APRA if this continues. I think if that happened, there would be serious discussions, a shotgun marriage, if you will, of the New Zealand banking system and the New Zealand monetary system, because the Australians would not allow that to happen.
Right.
So, what do we do?
On a brighter note.
Yes, on a brighter note, what do we do? This is my prescription, if you like. Easy for me to say, I don't have to get elected. I think we need a flatter, simpler tax system, which stops people from trying to avoid tax by investing in property. I think we need more productive investment. Now that can mean a stronger set of capital markets. It can mean banks lending more to businesses. I think we need a land tax or a capital gains tax. I congratulate the Greens for being pretty much the only party to have actually recommended this. I prefer a land tax. It's much broader and harder to avoid and would ensure those 10 or 20,000 lawyers and accountants who should be out of a job and doing something useful don't have anything to do. Brian Fallows suggested a GST on mortgages or rents. That's much more difficult, but an idea. The final suggestion I have is that the Reserve Bank currently has the power to force the banks to top up their capital to back their housing loans. Yeah. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned here is the change from Basel I to Basel II through 2006, 7, 8. This meant that in the past, banks had to put less capital aside for their housing, but it was a blunt instrument. Then under Basel II, they could decide how much capital they could put aside, and they could decide based on what their loan losses had been. Now, loan losses on housing lending had been low, so the banks had to put even less capital aside when they made housing loans. It effectively encouraged them to make housing loans. Now the bank has Basel II, but it has the ability to impose a regulatory top-up of 15%.
Look, it's a fantastic presentation. I'm going to round you off there because I know members are going to have questions. And somebody wants an iPod, fantastic. Most people in New Zealand have already got iPods, I understand. There's a few of us
Right.
that get ours.
That's right. We should give this Australian Labor politician an iPod too.
Absolutely, Mr. Keating, very good. Okay, so look, a very provocative presentation, and it goes to particularly two areas. Firstly, the data around pass-through, and secondly, some of the contextual issues around margins, profits.